Hi, and welcome everyone to the penultimate session of the Digital Science Showcase. Funder, publisher, researcher, service provider, how is COVID-19 changing us together? And so the rationale for this session is that obviously COVID-19 has had a profound effect on all of our own work practices, whether we're working from home in the middle of our families, if we're lucky enough to be working. And if we are still working, our life has probably become more intense. Our work life has become focused. We have perhaps a shrunken set of people that we engage with every day through our Zoom bubbles. It's certainly a different way of working. And whilst it's clear that life is changing for us and everyone around us, it's difficult for us to perceive how life is changing outside of our own Zoom bubbles. So we have less opportunities to serendipitously interact with each other on campuses. We're not being able to catch up with colleagues at the coffee to have a coffee, and so our ability to perceive what's going on has shrunk a little bit. And at the same time, the research world is rapidly changing. So if we just look at the number of COVID articles that are being published in research alone on dimensions, for instance, this year there's been 150,000 articles on dimensions, which, if you think about it, is about 7.5 times the output of the yearly output of a Harvard or a University of Toronto. So that's a huge volume of publications. And it's not only that there's a large number of publications emerging, but there's a new research field that has established itself around that. And that research field is not only growing, but it's also displacing other areas of research. So there's a huge amount of change going on in research. So today I thought I'd try and bring together a panel that tries to piece together a more holistic story of what's going on in COVID-19, bringing you together the perspectives of a researcher, the perspectives of how COVID-19 is affecting funders, the perspective of a service provider, and if we can fix some connection issues with our Crowdcast application, we'll also be able to bring you a perspective on how COVID-19 is changing the publishing landscape. So with that, I'll introduce our four speakers. Still with connection issues is Fred Fenter from Frontiers, and we do hope he can join us. As Executive Editor of Frontiers, Fred oversees a program of 900 open access journals covering more than 680 specialty areas, constituting one of the largest editorial boards in scientific publishing. He is also directly involved in public affairs, strategic partnerships, and innovation projects at Frontiers. So Fred, if we can get him on, will be representing a publisher perspective. Representing researchers today, we have Daniela Kirwan, who is the MRC Clinical Research Training Fellow at St George's University of London. And Daniela is a clinical academic trainee in medical microbiology and infectious diseases in London. She is currently an MRC Clinical Research Training Fellow at St George University, where she is completing a PhD on innate immune response to tuberculosis. And as part of her PhD project, she was working at the Universidad Peruna Cayet. I'm sorry, Danny, I'm going to pronounce this terribly wrong. Universidad Peruna Cayetano Heredia in Lima, Peru, until March 2020, when she returned to London to support the COVID-19 response, initially in her clinical role, and later as the project coordinator of the development and assessment of rapid testing for the SARS-CoV-2 outbreak, DARS, study at SGUL. And her main interests include tuberculosis, HIV, and global health. Representing the funding perspective today, we're lucky to have with us James Wilson, who is the director of the Research on Research Institute. And James is an interdisciplinary social scientist, and he works on the politics and governance of research. Over his career, in addition to academic posts at the University of Sheffield, Sussex, and Lancaster, he has worked in think tanks and as the Director of Science and Policy at the Royal Society, the UK's National Academy of Science. And recently, James has been involved in doing some deep thinking on how COVID-19 research is affecting funders and what their response will be. And then finally, we have Ryan Looney, and she is representing the service provider perspective today. And Ryan is the Client Services Manager at Overleaf. And she has been managing the support team and the implementation of Overleaf at universities and institutions. And during the COVID-19 work lockdown period, Ryan has been managing the Overleaf Professional Work from Home initiative, providing users with free Overleaf upgrades so that they can continue to work and collaborate from home. And during this time, this is a staggering number, she has processed 45,000 upgrade requests and has learnt about their different projects and challenges along the way, which is quite staggering. So with that, we were going to begin with Fred, but hopefully he will join us later. So that means we will move instead to Daniela as our first speaker, if that's okay, Daniela.
Yep, brilliant. Okay, so I'm going to share some slides. I can find it. Okay. Can you see the slides?
Yeah, hopefully in a moment.
Not coming up?
Not just yet. What's it looking like on your screen?
Try again. Application window.
Oh, Fred's joined us. Hopefully that means he can connect.
Oh, brilliant. That's interesting. I don't seem to be able to find the slides to share, I'm afraid. Sorry, this worked perfectly well earlier.
It did. It did work perfectly before.
Okay.
Excellent. There's Fred.
Okay.
Oh. Well, how about you? Can you get the slides on your own screen if you want to just maybe perhaps talk to them and we'll listen?
It says it's sharing them. You can't see it? Okay, let me stop and try one more time. Oh, it says that the stream is limited to, if some of you could turn off your camera, that might allow me to share something here.
Lovely, I will do that. I'll turn off my camera.
No, it's still not allowing me to share anything. You might be fine without the slides. Okay. All right, I can talk without the slides. That's absolutely fine. So thank you for the invitation, and sorry for the slightly delayed start. So as Simon said, my name is Danny, and I'm a clinical research training fellow at St. George's University. So I just wanted to start by talking a little bit about me and my journey. So I'm a medical doctor, and I qualified in 2007 from the University of Leeds. And since then I've been working in various different specialties, and from 2013 I started my training in infectious diseases and medical microbiology, which is my chosen specialty. As Simon mentioned, I've been working in global health research and advocacy throughout this time. And in 2017, I started doing a PhD in tuberculosis and immune responses. And as part of this, I moved to Lima in 2018, to Lima, Peru, to recruit some patients with TB and to progress my work. And unexpectedly in March, the pandemic occurred and I had to return to the UK. A lockdown was announced and I came back that same day and found myself back in South London. So I arrived on March the 17th and spent the next 3 weeks working on a COVID ward as a doctor. So this was a new disease for all of us, and lots of staff were repurposed to specialties that they're not usually that they're not used to. So I was working with surgeons, dentists, orthopedic doctors, and we all felt a little bit out of our depth, but fortunately everybody was very collaborative and supported each other. So there was lots of sharing of information during this time through different means. So in the hospital, each department will tend to have a journal club, usually weekly, where we will discuss a paper and critically appraise it, and then grand rounds, which are open to the whole hospital, where typically cases are presented, and then there's a discussion after that. So during the COVID time, all of this was dedicated to the subject of COVID. And also there, as with probably most people's workplaces, we have endless WhatsApp groups, and there were lots of studies and other information being shared through there. So the types of information that we were reviewing, so there were lots of cases of patients that were being seen on the wards and discussions surrounding those, guidelines that were being produced both locally and also from other countries and other international institutions that were being turned to and often adapted for our use. Lots of published studies that initially these came largely out of China, who had a bit of a head start on us, and then some Italian papers, and very quickly there was lots of information available that had been through a peer review process and had been published. And just wanted to take a moment to thank all of the publishers who made so much of this content open access, that made things so much easier for us. And then finally, papers that were being published through preprint servers that I will talk about a little bit more in a moment. So the types of questions that we had were, we were learning about a new disease and how it presents and how it affects patients. And it was clear from the start that COVID is somewhat different to other viral infections and other pneumonias. So that was of interest. Also, how to interpret the test results we were getting back. So for example, if somebody's still positive a week after their first test, does that mean that they're still infectious, and is it safe to send them home? Questions about whether there are any drugs that might be useful, and St. George's Hospital has been participating in a number of treatment trials, and also non-medication care, for example, in intensive care units, different methods of ventilating patients and whether they should be cared for on their fronts or their backs, and things like that that were of interest to all of us. Then, as of April, I was employed as the study coordinator of a study called known as DARTS. Like all studies, we have an acronym for us, the name. And this had two main purposes. One of them was to collect samples to facilitate the development of tests, including antibody and antigen tests. And we were working with a commercial company called Malogic for this. And secondly, is an observational study of the patients in our hospital to again try and learn from them. So I wanted to talk about a few challenges of research in SARS-CoV-2 infection. Firstly, the challenges and differences, I suppose. So a lot of the bureaucratic processes that we would usually go for were expedited. So grant reviews, ethical approvals were extremely fast, which allowed us to implement the studies very quickly. So this raised a few questions of, are all the usual processes really necessary? Do things have to be so slow? And does this delay our ability to be able to make progress in other areas? Secondly, unusually for research, particularly in infectious diseases, work was being done in parallel across the globe. We're very used to being able to build on research done in prior studies elsewhere and to do a literature review and to develop that further. So this was unusual in that everything was being done simultaneously. And I believe this was an unprecedented situation. In terms of the speed and volume of publications that were coming out, I cannot think of any other illness or situation where there was such a huge interest all of a sudden in the same condition. So this led also to a lack of standardization across different studies. So definitions of what a case was, what a severe versus mild illness was, methods being used, tests being used, which makes it very difficult to evaluate the data together. And also because there was such a rush to start studying the patients that were so quickly accumulating in the hospitals, the study designs were not as well thought through as they normally would be. A lot of the studies could say were a little bit opportunistic, and then again that causes challenges in the interpretation of data they provide. Also, having worked with a commercial company during this, I got a brief insight into issues around transparency and interests. So interest could be commercial or political, and this is not really my area, and I was not really involved in this aspect of the work, but needless to say that the best performing test isn't always the one that gets the big contracts. So that was a challenge. And then finally, in developing tests, we were trying to meet the requirements of the British government and also lots of the bodies that regulate tests and devices. And some of these requirements and demands were a little confusing and also changed very rapidly from one week to the next. So I just wanted to end with some thoughts on preprints. So there were lots of benefits that helped us during this time. So the immediate access that we had to the data was vital, I think, especially from the point of view of the clinical team, in that we obviously had lots of patients in front of us and lots of questions, and the fact that we were able to see the experiences of other centres and to see the research coming out almost in real time. So that was fantastic. From the point of view of a researcher, I believe this was also instrumental in minimising the duplication of studies in different settings, because we could, again, obviously see the results that were coming out, which was very helpful as we were developing and going through the study. And then just to note that I'm very fortunate in being surrounded by some extremely experienced and very eminent scientists and clinicians alike, who are all very skilled in assessing studies and assessing the quality and also the relevance of the data to our own setting. So this was a huge learning opportunity where there was lots of dialogue between juniors and seniors, and I think the benefit worked both ways there. So this really highlights the importance of all the training that we get in research methods, of every week sitting down and going through a paper and critiquing the stats that were chosen to analyze data, etc., and of the constant dialogue that we have in meetings. A few concerns that we may have around preprints, or rather cautions. One is that the fact that all research is able to be immediately uploaded onto a preprint server. Obviously, there are some checks that they undergo, but this means that there's a much broader range in the quality of work that is accessible. And we don't have the sort of safety net of the peer review process to ensure the quality. Also, a lot of the reviews, systematic reviews, meta-analyses, and other types of data synthesis that have been published recently, I've noted have included a lot of preprint studies, and so there's some concern there around the fact that these data are possibly unfinished, or that when they subsequently go through the peer review process, they may be modified or changed slightly. And I'm not sure what mechanisms exist for the updating of reviews that have already been published. And then finally, that this situation led to a lot of people who are not trained or used to appraising scientific data suddenly had a big interest in it and were very vocal about their opinions. So this includes people from the general public, politicians and policymakers, and also obviously the media. So there's a big danger here that data can be misinterpreted or can be overinterpreted, or that the findings won't be adequately contextualized. And this isn't a criticism, it's just that a lot of people had very good intentions, but there were a number of newspaper articles, for example, that reported things that were not scientifically accurate. So and it's often very difficult to really understand the meaning of some of the data that are there. And notably, there have been a few high-profile papers that have been retracted by journals during this time. And obviously, these data managed to get through the peer review process, and there's eagle-eyed people who really picked them apart and were able to notice this. So yeah, so just a bit of caution, I think, needs to be employed in the interpretation of data. But overall, we found it extremely beneficial both in the clinical scenario and in the research scenario. So thank you. I think that's probably a little bit longer than 7 minutes. And obviously, apologies for not having any slides to share with you here. Looking forward to the discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Danny. And we will move swiftly on to Fred from Frontiers, who is going to give us a publisher perspective on how things have changed.
Hi, thanks everyone. Sorry about the strange lighting. I wasn't expecting the autumn to settle in so quickly. I'm in my garden cabin. So I guess I understand we're not doing this without slides, which is kind of a shame because I had sort of a visual program to present. But let me just start by saying a few words about Frontiers. So I'm the executive editor at Frontiers, an open access publisher that's currently the 12th largest publisher in terms of articles published. But more importantly, among the group of 20 largest scientific publishers, we're already the 5th most cited. We take a very technologically driven approach. We have a platform that's AI driven, and we refer to it as our open science platform. This month we hit a milestone where we exceeded 1 billion views and downloads of our articles via the platform. So we're actually quite proud of that. Frontiers is above all a community, and when the COVID pandemic hit, what we found was that this emergency actually reinforced the sense of community that we have, both around internally around our employees, around the 800 people or so that work at Frontiers, but also around our external editorial board. So we have about 100,000 people that participate on our editorial boards across the 80 or so journals that we publish. So from the very beginning, there was a sense of pulling together and pulling talents and resources to make a contribution towards the resolution of the pandemic, but also to use our tools and expertise to keep the flow of validated scientific research to the world. Now, as Danny was saying there, I think we could spend this whole session just talking about what COVID has revealed about the peer review process. I'll say a few words about that, but I do think that the importance of the validation of scientific outputs was really something that was exposed during this pandemic. So as I was saying, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the actions that we took as a publisher. Internally in Frontiers, we provided support groups. We surveyed our users, our editors, our authors to see how they were faring. We organized webinars. So internally, but I think more interestingly, externally, we organized a number of virtual editorial meetings that were massively attended by thousands of people. And what we could really see is that our editorial boards really, at that time, there was a real need to pull together around this sense of community, around a frame that allowed people to actually act and use their scientific expertise to do something positive. And in some senses, we were probably never in better contact with our editorial boards, ironically, than during the first stages of the COVID pandemic. One major action that we took at Frontiers was we launched what we call the Coronavirus Knowledge Hub. It's a resource that a lot of many organizations launched resources a little bit along these lines. But we are a publisher with 100,000 editorial board members, and we have a community that were really ready to stand up and make their contribution to inform the world and to draw. They were there that we could really benefit from the fact that they were ready to stand up and attack this problem together. One or two of the features of this coronavirus hub, there was one feature that was very successful, was the funding monitor. So we provided a real-time catalog of funding opportunities from private and public sources. It was a hand-curated listing of the funding mechanisms as they became available to the research community, and it was supplemented by a stream of information from Mendeley. So it was really a collaboration with Elsevier, also with Science Europe, and the third partner was Open Pharma in the UK. So we developed a nice collaboration around this idea of providing real-time information about different grants as they became available. We were able to provide information about 1.5 billion total funding. And on top of that, the other thing we did in this space was to provide funders who needed to find reviewers relatively quickly to look at and assess these various grant requests that were coming in. We provided free access to our AI-driven expert finder for all those funders that felt that they needed that extra help in terms of being able to quickly find the right experts in terms of just evaluating the different grant proposals. And another thing that we did on this coronavirus hub is we conducted expert interviews with leaders across academic disciplines, and we did this via a series of our own editors, and we conducted a second series in collaboration with the International Union of Immunological Societies, and then of course as a publisher, we also launched a large series of interdisciplinary projects, article collections. We published over 100 different article collections on all aspects of COVID, and to date, I think we've accepted well over 1,000 articles across these different article collections, and the articles continue to come in. So I think that's also, from our perspective, one real contribution that we can make as a publisher. What we did is we set up a task force of editors that were ready to stand by and provide a rapid peer review for the articles that we were receiving. Now, I have to say that the articles that we received on COVID had a particularly high rejection rate, but we did get 180 members of the editorial boards who were willing to participate and act as a sort of a standby resource in terms of making sure that this very time-sensitive content was validated in a reasonable period of time. And just to say that to date, these articles have been viewed more than 4 million times. So the hub has quickly emerged as a trusted resource. And so I could say the whole team, we felt this very gratifying, strong sense of community around all of these actions that we conducted in this coronavirus hub. I think what's also interesting in this context is that we conducted a survey among our editorial board members and our network. We sent a survey out with our partner Qualtrics to several 100,000 people, and we had 25,000 people that responded from 153 countries. We're going to be publishing the results of this survey very, very soon, probably next week. But it really does provide a rich insight into the working conditions, the resilience, and the optimism of the world's research communities. Maybe during the question and answer session, I'll have time to say a little bit more about that. But this survey will be published in Frontiers in Public Health with a data set that will become available on Figshare. As I say, probably already next week. And the other thing that we've done at Frontiers is we've launched a new project which we call the Frontiers Policy Labs. And this is basically grows out of the COVID pandemic, which has forced us to address system failures in a new way. I mean, with COVID, as Danny was saying, there's never been a better demonstration of the need for an effective policy and science interface. And so our answer to this is the launch of this policy lab. So this is this is a resource that will be made available within a few days. Also, it'll be launched with a series of interviews. Now we're calling this an interview series "Conversations with Jean-Claude Bergelmann," and we'll be opening it with a round of very, very interesting high-level interviews. For example, with Robert John Smits, with Peter Gluckman. With James Wilsdon, who's here with us today, with Helga Novotny, and with Jennifer Hansen. I'm sure you know all who these people are. Really absolute thought leaders in this space of scientific policy. And the idea of these discussions is really to develop a common thread. What did we learn from this coronavirus situation? We're not talking about sound bites. We're talking about substantial sort of fireside discussions between well-informed people. So I just want to also point out that this was supported in part by the Keystone Symposia people. Yeah, and voilà. I think I'll stop with that. The policy labs, really the concept is the COVID is not going to be the only challenge that we face as a society, and we'd really like to be able to make sure that the research results of science are presented in a way that can best be exploited by people in the policy space.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Fred. And with that, we will move swiftly on to James, who will give us a funder perspective.
Great. Hi. Can you hear me okay, Simon?
Perfect.
Great. Thank you. Sorry, I'm doing this on my phone because we were having tech problems of a different kind, but hopefully you can still hear me okay. Thank you, Digital Science. Thanks to Simon for inviting me onto this panel. I'm rather fraudulently billed as speaking on behalf of funders. I mean, I am, of course, an academic, not a funder, but the Research on Research Institute, which I direct, is in large part composed of research funders as a consortium, and it's with them that we are undertaking research on research systems, cultures and decision making, and of course also with digital science. So if I can channel their individual and collective views to some extent in my remarks, I hope that's acceptable as a proxy for an actual funder, as it were. But yes, I mean, I'll pick up and perhaps expand on some of the points that we just heard from Fred. As he mentioned, I was fortunate to be one of Jean-Claude Bergelmann's victims or guests. I don't know what the right term is for his forthcoming series of policy labs, which was very enjoyable and interesting. And in that, we talked a bit about some of these issues that I'm going to touch on now. But I think for me, I mean, there's lots one could say, and I mean, I've only got 5 minutes, so I'll be selective. But for me, as we're sort of coming through the first wave, and obviously in some places at certain points potentially entering the next one, certainly speaking from Sheffield where I am at the moment, there's an alarming spike in COVID-19 cases over the past week. But in strategic terms, having come through the first wave of funder responses, through which we saw, of course, this enormous outpouring of responses of various kinds, as of course we did from the research community and from publishers, new funding schemes, often very agile, flexible funding mechanisms to try and mobilize a response that was commensurate, appropriate to the scale of the global challenge. As we move sort of out of that phase and into what comes next, I think there are some very interesting and still very uncertain questions for the funding community. So I'll just touch very briefly on three aspects of that. The first is what I'd sort of cluster under the heading of ripples and waves. The second is the tension or the relationship, the balance between quality, rigor, fairness and agility, which of course applies to the publishing and communication side of the scientific enterprise and also to the funding side. And then the final point would be about the macro funding and policy environment for science and research. So very quickly, if I do sort of a couple of minutes on each of those. Ripples and waves. Rory, Research on Research, when it's normally operating in pre and hopefully one day post-pandemic times, is situated in the Wellcome Trust. And I'm going to borrow an initial point from Jeremy Farrar, the director of the Wellcome Trust, who I think is one of the most perceptive commentators and actors in all sorts of respect on the current pandemic. But Jeremy wrote a very interesting piece in the Financial Times at the end of July, where he talked about, well, the title of the piece was "The Worst of COVID-19 May Still Be to Come," and he argued in that piece that we may still, even while we observe the chaos and carnage around us, we may still be underestimating the true scale of the longer term shifts that come about from this whole episode. And he talked in that piece about the sort of concentric ripples that you get when you drop a stone in a pond. And in the context of the pandemic, the first circle, as it were, the first ripple out being the immediate impact of the virus, all the dreadful effects we've seen in terms of deaths and ill health, etc. The second circle being the more indirect effects on health and health systems. So not only obviously things like long COVID, but also missed health. My own father, I should say, just missed his prostate cancer checkup, just been diagnosed with resurgent cancer. So an issue close to my own heart right now. So all of those health effects. And then as you sort of move further out in those circles, the third circle being the social and economic impacts of joblessness, restructuring of economies, etc. And I mean, we're only just at the beginning of seeing that here in the UK as elsewhere. And then the fourth ripple being geopolitics, how all of this leaves the world and the different power dynamics at play 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now. So that I think is a very helpful way to think about research funding as well, because in research funding terms, we've also focused up to now primarily on the first wave. It's, well, what do funders do in response to that first ripple, i.e. how can they mobilize funds to tackle those immediate health challenges, whether it's in terms of funding for vaccines or therapeutics, diagnostics, or some of the other kind of more immediate health and related issues. That's been the focus, and we've seen a lot of activity in digital science, and others have documented this. We are now seeing more funders moving into a sort of second wave of funding response, which is directed towards some of the broader social, economic, health system effects beyond the pandemic itself. But I think we also discern the outlines of a sort of third wave of funder responses, which is where COVID-19 is taken as the stimulus for a deeper reevaluation of priorities and balance within funding systems. Are we spending enough on not only emerging infectious diseases, pandemic preparedness in general rather than COVID-19 specific, but are we also spending enough in preparedness in other areas? Yes, it's very tempting, of course, in the wake of what's happened over the past 9 months to plough money into pandemic preparedness, but might it be an asteroid strike that finishes us off? Might it be a biosecurity, bioweapon type thing in another realm? There's a whole range of things that we are not good as societies in thinking about and investing in. So I think all of those questions are very important. We've been talking to the leadership of a lot of funders, and we've got a piece coming out on this in the next couple of months that will hopefully explore how people in those kind of seats, as it were, at the top of funders are thinking about this. I'm going on too long already. Second, rigor, fairness, and agility. I'll be much quicker. We've seen this, of course, in the communication publishing realm in terms of the debate about preprints, openness, and also concerns in some respects, at least, about quality. I mean, this was mentioned already. Same, of course, applies to funding. I mean, in some ways, that if you make mistakes, as it were, by funding the wrong things, the mistake doesn't always show up until 2, 3, 5 years down the line. So it may be less immediately spotted and responded to. But there's, of course, a big challenge for funders in balancing the need to respond with agility and urgency to a situation like this, and then the need to maintain appropriate processes of review and also, of course, to be very, very conscious of fairness. I mean, this is something that's had a lot, I'm sure, in Fred's survey of the research community. This is going to come up a lot, and we've seen it in other studies. The very, very uneven playing field that has been created by the pandemic in terms of some people in the research community having more time than ever to churn out papers and write grant applications. Others, of course, juggling young kids, caring responsibilities, long COVID, whatever it might be, having a radically reduced capacity to engage in all of those activities. So, if you're a funder, what do you do about the funding proposals that never came in because, 30% of your potential applicant pool has been diverted into doing homeschooling, 3 days a week, or whatever. And it's also been the case in this house. Very, very difficult. Finally, macrofunding environment. Here again, very, very uneven. I mean, if you're a Wellcome or you're a big foundation, you've got a lot of flexibility, liquidity in your asset base, actually a lot of them come through the turbulence of this year in quite a strong position, because they were able to, play the markets and reinvest appropriately at the bottom and, watch things go up again. So some foundations have actually come out in a very strong position. Research funders that have been reliant primarily on public-facing funding, so medical research charities in particular, things like Cancer Research UK, very badly hit, because of course a lot of the activity that would have generated funds for their research and their work more generally have just not happened. Fund runs and sponsored this, sponsored that. So that area really badly hit. Public funders, it's a very mixed picture. I mean, I've talked probably to the heads of 8 or 9 national funding agencies in the last 2 weeks about this. In general, people are nervous, some more cautiously optimistic than others. It's hard to look at any of the broad economic data coming out of this and feel confident about the capacity of most governments and most tax bases to sustain significant increases in research funding or in many other areas of public expenditure over a long period coming out of this. Here in the UK, of course, the government said it will, so we'll hold them to that when the spending review comes. But very, very uncertain. So very mixed picture. I've gone on too long. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, James. And finally, we will move on to Ryan, who's going to give us a service provider's perspective. And I've just been told that we're allowed to run over by 5 minutes, Ryan, so don't feel that you need to complete everything in 3 minutes.
I'll talk real fast. So thank you for inviting me to this. This has been really interesting to hear how all of these other folks have been affected by COVID. And I'm here specifically to talk about Overleaf as a service provider and what the impact of COVID has been on us and on our users. So if you're not already familiar with Overleaf, we are a collaborative cloud-based writing platform, primarily for LaTeX, which is used to write up lots of science and math kinds of things. So we say it's a little bit like Google Docs for science. And our users are anybody who might be writing up science. So that's all the way down to middle school students with their lab notebooks, university students, postgraduate researchers, professors, etc. So we've got a really wide range of users who are using our platform. And so what was the impact of COVID on Overleaf users? I do have slides, and for this one, I have a picture of the New York Times in March, where it says colleges and universities cancel classes and move online amid coronavirus fears. And if you remember all the way back to March, it seems like so long ago, and yet only yesterday, but I live in a university town, as I'm sure many of you do, and students really had to just pick up and leave. A lot of them left all their possessions in their dorm rooms thinking they were coming back, and we know that didn't happen. So really everybody left kind of midstream. Everybody who could be remote is remote. And co-location is now a thing of the past. So we do have some folks who are able to come back together, but for now, remote seems like the default for a lot of people, and there's a lot of uncertainty about the future. Meanwhile, that work has to go on. So work-wise at Overleaf, there was very little impact to our operations, our business operations. We are a remote-first team, so we do have a few seats in an office, but they're, the most of us are, in our home offices every day anyway. So it was always business as usual. But, personally, we were all affected as well. So just as everyone else is feeling that strain, the kids at home and doing homeschool and that kind of thing, that obviously has affected us all. And we really felt that. And we immediately wanted to help our users any way we could. So I think we first met, a few of us as a team, on March 13th, and by March 18th, we had what we started referring to as the work from home groups up and running. So what the work from home group was is it was a temporary upgrade to a premium Overleaf subscription, which allows an unlimited number of collaborators so that workers can work with as many folks as they would like to during this time. So we had pretty lightweight process that we just sort of put out there. We put up a little Google form, and I was adding folks manually to a group. And through all those 45,000 users that Simon mentioned earlier who requested an upgrade, most of those were added basically by hand. We did some things to make, we were able to copy and paste in bigger batches and that kind of thing. But a lot of it was done by hand, and we had 33,000 folks accept that invitation. Those came to an end over the summer, but we've since provided people with a discount on upgrades, and we've had a couple thousand of those folks as well. So really, it was a team effort. It wasn't just, you know, having the group, but it was writing blog posts and doing social and taking support queries, a little bit of dev work to make life easier as it scaled. But, you know, what we really noticed is Fred had mentioned the sense of community that was sort of unexpected that came around this. And we had a field for comments on the form, and it wasn't required, but we got so many comments. We had just literally hundreds of thank yous listed, and we had people tell us about their projects, a lot of COVID researchers, a lot of students. We had people write in things like, have a nice day, random person. So it was, you know, really a bright spot in a tough time, I think, both for us and for the folks who were able to reach out to us a little bit. We also launched a free webinar series as well that's still ongoing. So going forward, we have just discontinued this week the discounts that we're offering, but we do still have like an Overleaf work from home page with resources for people. I didn't have time to talk about how we sell our enterprise level accounts, but those are still proceeding. And really, we are just looking to support our users any way we can. We're always a very user-focused company. We love meeting our users at events and have really missed that. And overall, we're doing whatever we can in these tough times to continue on our mission of making the whole process of academic collaboration easier and more effective. And that's all from me.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Ryan. Unfortunately, we were going to have a question round, but in 1 minute and a half, I don't think that's fair to anybody. So what I will say is I'm really pleased with the stories that came out through our 4 different speakers. With Danny, we had the story of communities on the front line that were new and coming together to work together on COVID-19 solutions. We heard similar stories from Fred about editorial boards coming together and thinking about how to solve the problems of COVID together. And again, with James, that community discussion between funders on how to address these changing problems. And then we heard the stories from Ryan about how the Overleaf community came together to respond to that problem. And I hope when the COVID story is told, we hear about all of those responses to COVID coming through. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for coming as we complete and move on to our final session of the day. So thank you again, and thank you to our speakers.